Well, they surprised me, and we're on. Welcome to Social Work Live at the Columbia School of Social Work. I'm Michael Friedman, the host of these conversations that we have every week. And it's my privilege every week to interview somebody from the Columbia community who's doing something interesting in the world of social work. We'll talk for about 15 minutes or a little more, and then we'll wait for your question. Well, we won't wait, we'll keep going. If you don't ask questions, we'll keep going. So get your questions ready. You can put them onto your screen, on your Facebook screen, someplace. I'm not sure where that is. We have two wonderful guests today, Jeanette Takamura, who is not only the former dean of our school, but the former assistant secretary for aging of the United States of America during the Clinton administration, right? Yeah, so a real expert on aging. And we have Jinyu Liu, who is an assistant professor here and is doing some very interesting research, some of which I've looked at on family caregiving, which is really interesting and hopefully we'll talk about. Yeah. And our topic today is aging, which is a worldwide phenomenon, and I'm just going to turn to Jeanette to make some comments about what's going on in our world.
Sure. So it is our world, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. That's right.
Actually, I want to start by thanking you and also Mary Leah Cox-Awanahara and the entire staff. I mean, this doesn't just happen. You and I just don't walk in. The three of us don't just walk in here. There's a lot of work that goes on. So just thank you to everyone. And yeah, it is an aging world, and so we should celebrate that. But maybe what I will do is make 3 points a little down the road, and not too far down the road, and start with the fact that if you look at the dependency ratios in China, Japan, and the U.S., they're very instructive. They tell us a lot about the
Well, let me
future.
just interrupt you there so
Sure.
you can explain what a dependency ratio is, because
Sure.
not everybody's going to know.
Okay. So it's actually the ratio of people who are in the workforce and those who are, retirement age. And it tells us a lot about what society must carry if we think about the older adult population as being dependent. So in Japan, the ratio is 2.3 to one person. And in the U.S., it's 3.5 to one person, but it will become 2.5 to 1 in 2050. In China, what most people talk about is the one-child policy,
right,
and how one boy will need to support his parents and then 2 sets of grandparents. But that's a very gendered...
And his children.
Yes, and his children. But that's a really gendered approach, Michael.
Uh-huh.
So if we start to think about it from what will a woman in China need to support? It's actually 2 sets of parents and 2 sets of grandparents, right? So that's 8 people plus children. That's a heavy load for a woman to carry. So we have to really begin to take these issues seriously. And the 3 points I want to make quickly are these. That when we think about aging, I think the area that affords us the greatest opportunity to show our strengths as a profession and to really recognize the multidimensional and multidisciplinary nature of aging is the area of long-term care, which Jinyu Liu also does research in. And so I will talk about that briefly, but the second point is this. In 1999, we were successful in getting the National Family Caregiver Support Program passed by Congress and signed into law. And even as we advocated for that, and even after its passage, I said to people, this is not the panacea. And I can talk about that a little too later. The third thing that I tell students and just about everyone I speak to is when you think about aging and long-term care, location, location, location. Really important. So if you're in China, if you're in Japan, if in the U.S., where you live matters because of the service abundance or lack of, because of the fact that in the United States there are 52 different versions of Medicaid, right? And frankly, if you're in a rural community versus an urban community, there's a big difference, not just in services, but human resources.
When you say location, are you also talking about the location of family?
Sure.
So one of the things that's characteristic
Sure.
of the United States is that many families are dispersed around the country.
Absolutely, yes.
I don't know about that as a phenomenon in Japan and China, whether
Yeah,
families
well,
also are.
in China, and Jinyu Liu can certainly speak to that one, there's a really big trend towards migration to urban areas, which leaves older people and children often left behind.
So what happens as that as people drift towards the city to make a living and to make lives for themselves that are different from the lives they had in the rural areas?
Yeah.
What happens to the people who are left behind?
Usually, as Jeanette said, usually are the older adults and the younger children.
Right.
Sometimes maybe women
Right.
left behind in rural countryside areas. And most of the times, the older adults actually are not the care receivers. Most of the time, they are the caregivers for
Right.
the children.
Well, I think that's really interesting because when we talk about the dependency ratio, for example, the Census Bureau does that every year, and I guess
Right.
others do it as well. And the assumption is that older adults are dependent,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's
exactly.
not a good assumption.
No, it's
No.
not a good assumption. I mean, frankly, my father died at 103. We thought he
Wow.
was going to make it to 110.
Yeah.
And he was sharp as a whip until the very end. So, and he was running the nursing home staff around.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, of course, a lot of people at 103 are not sharp as a.
Well,
as a
that's
whip.
true.
There are a few.
But
There are a
more
few.
will be.
But before that, if we look at the spread of population, the majority of older adults are between the ages of 65 and 80, let us say, and most of that population is not disabled. In fact, even in the mid-80s, it's only about half of the population who are disabled enough to need help with everyday living. So,
But
there's us.
there
There's
are,
us,
and we need
here
to
we
do
are.
all the good things.
Right.
Eat well, sleep a lot. Sleep 8 hours, as Carmen Alcantara will say. Exercise and so on. But if you look in the U.S., there are 4 million of the greatest generation. There are about 28 million of the silent generation. And I think you're a baby boomer.
No,
you're not. You're silent
no,
generation.
you're a baby
Okay, all right,
boomer.
I'm a baby boomer.
I'm older than you.
All right, okay. So the baby boomers are 76 million. Add it all up, it's 90-something million people who are 65 years of age and older. That's a large segment of the population.
And it's a segment that can make a contribution
Absolutely.
as well as a
Of course.
segment that needs some
Absolutely.
help along
And
the
they
way.
are making contributions, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You're nodding your head, yes, they're making a contribution?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Any-
in the recent years, I'm doing research on caregiving, on family caregivers. Actually, most of caregivers themselves are kind of in the older population.
That's right.
Thinking about if you take care of your parents who age 80s, 90s, or even 100 years old, usually we could imagine, the caregivers themselves could age maybe 60s or even 70s. Or a lot of older adults also are cared by their spouse.
That's right.
Right.
Most of the times the caregivers and care receivers probably are at a similar age.
So the general perception about family caregivers is that they're under enormous stress and that they're more likely to experience depression and anxiety disorders as well as physical disorders. And so some of us, you certainly have been focused on what supports can we provide to family caregivers so that they can carry the load.
Right.
The load that they carry is enormous.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know about China and Japan, but in this country, most of the work that's done to help people who need help is done by family caregivers, yeah.
I think Jinyu should speak about that in a few minutes. Let me just make one quick point. I said earlier that caregiving is not the panacea. And the reason I say that is we don't have a system of long-term care services and programs and policies in the United States. And the truth is that caregivers do suffer. So, frankly, I'm an advocate for a universal program that would help finance long-term care services and supports across the country.
So that's really interesting. As you both know, I'm sure, there was some effort when Obamacare was
Right.
created to have a section on long-term care. what got included in the bill was extremely limited, and then
Right.
got knocked out
I
later
could
on.
have predicted that.
Yeah.
It wasn't actuarially sound.
Uh-huh.
It really wasn't.
Oh.
I mean, right from the get-go, it had to be, frankly, pulled back. So, yeah.
Well, I work on these issues, as you know, on
Right.
the advocacy side, and I'm always stunned by all the talk there is about long-term care reform and the lack of action related to it. So,
Yeah.
a part of what that means, of course, is let's keep people out of nursing homes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I frankly begin to think that's all that it means, because there's so little public investment that's made in building up the kind of system that
Exactly.
you're talking about.
Right.
And if we talk about universal health coverage, for example, long-term care is not part of that picture.
Exactly right.
Right? Some
But
people in
that's-
their Medicare for All proposals, of which there are 8 or 10 or
Right,
12
there are
different
8.
8 varieties, but some of them include long-term care coverage, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No problem. Yeah, I agree. Taking care of family members, especially who are frail, who are in their later life, is not an easy job. It's not an easy task, but it still could be rewarding.
Yeah.
Now, in your recent article,
Mm-hmm.
you reported on something that you found that I thought was fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a former family caregiver. I've taken care of several family members along the way, and I'll confess, it stressed me out. I mean, it was
Yeah.
really tough. But you reported something very interesting, which is that some people are not stressed out by it, or at least less stressed out by it than others. So what makes the difference?
Yeah, I think you are talking about the paper about filial piety and
Yes.
psychological well-being
Right,
of
that's right.
caregivers. Yeah, in that paper, in that study, I examined 3 traits or 3 aspects of filial piety.
Filial
Filial piety.
piety.
Yes.
And what is filial piety?
Yeah, filial piety is the central. I would like to say that's a central norm in
Asia.
Asian families. It teaches people to respect, to support, and to take care of their older family members,
Right.
especially for adult children.
So if I could say that a different way, there are some people who have a strong moral commitment
Yeah.
to taking care of their families.
I would say most Asian people have such strong expectation for themselves.
And some
because-
white people too.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, I
people
agree.
around the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
around the world. Yeah.
But there
And
is
it's also, I
this
think,
concept,
characteristic
yeah.
of
Yeah.
black communities
Right,
where there's
right,
a stronger.
right.
But I
Exactly.
can give you an example to show how strong the expectation is in Asian families.
Yeah.
For example, I'm a Chinese, so Chinese is my native language. The word family caregiver or
Right.
family caregiving did not exist in Chinese until in recent years.
Right.
This word has been translated to, from English to Chinese.
Right.
So which shows that, taking care of older adults, that's just a natural component,
Right.
in someone's
So
daily life.
just to
Yeah.
pursue this, in your paper, as I recall, you identify that there are some people who have family piety or a strong moral commitment to taking care of their families, and then some people live up to that, and some people perceive themselves as not living up to that.
Right. Yeah. So I look at the filial expectation. So how people expect themselves, or what kind of level they expect themselves to perform to be a filial person. And the second concept I examine is the filial performance. How people evaluate their actual performance, their actual behavior for their frail older family members.
And then
And
if
the third one is the discrepancy
Between the two.
between these two.
So if you have a strong moral feeling and you don't feel like you're measuring up,
They will feel very stressed.
Stress.
so
out.
they're more likely to feel stressed out.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Right? So a
yeah.
person like me who didn't feel he was doing enough would then be more stressed out than a person who said, I'm really doing everything I can,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's the way they feel about it. But that's interesting that there's
Yeah.
that differentiation. It's also interesting that there's a moral dimension to it.
It comes
me.
from Confucian teachings
Uh-huh.
way, way, way back.
Yeah.
It's actually rooted in that. Yeah.
So, I mean, I find that fascinating. one of the things we said we were going to talk about today is what the health implications are of the growth of the aging population. And we've said so far that, older people are not as decrepit as we generally think of them as being, which is important to acknowledge. But certainly there are health needs that emerge and grow in old age.
Right.
I have a friend, Alice, who's now 94, and she's been saying for about 10 years now, aging is not good for your health. So,
That's interesting. Oh dear. Yeah.
well, for most of us,
Yeah.
we develop some chronic
Illnesses. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Right. And so most of us sit around the table and talk about those chronic illnesses
That's
the
what
older we get.
every
right?
social event begins with the
Right.
organ recital.
Oh,
as it's
God. Oh, that's very funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why Medicare is so important, right? And all of the supplemental plans, et cetera, because access to health care really matters. And it's so different depending upon where you live, once again, but also your race and ethnicity, your age, whether you're advanced in years or not. So there are lots of variables that
Just
figure
before
in.
we get to the first question, as you point out, healthcare is very important. My thinking about this is that we have a healthcare system in the United States, I can't speak about other places, which is acute care oriented.
Yes,
And as you just said,
Yes.
as we age, we develop chronic conditions. And,
exactly
and
right.
I suspect that makes a difference in how we should organize our health system. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The question is whether we have a real system that works, a health system. We certainly do not have a long-term care system.
Right.
But when you try to patch them together, it's a monumental task to try to actually construct a policy framework and, and operationalize it. I actually think that countries like China that are building up their infrastructures now can learn from the mistakes we've made, but not just our mistakes. They learn from also the mistakes and the, frankly, wins that other countries besides the United States have made. I mean, they're looking at Denmark and Germany and other countries, Japan,
Well, then
So-
they all have different systems. One of the things
Absolutely.
we hear all the time now, particularly from politicians, is as if all the European countries have the same healthcare system, and they all have very different
Right.
systems. So,
Right.
but let's jump to some of these questions. The first question is, do you think that family caregivers should get a stipend? I don't know which of you would like to take that question.
Well, the truth of the matter is that family caregivers and caregiving needs to be less gendered than it is. And if there are ways to provide some kind of financial relief, that would be great. But that isn't enough, to be honest. And part of the reason that we've got to think broadly and systemically is because there are going to be human resource issues down the road that we may not be able to get over. So if that's the case, there are demonstrations that have occurred in different states that have made long-term care much more person-centered. So the individual could hire a family member,
Right.
or pay a family member, if you will. Those are things that we have to really re-examine and think about in light of the expectation that we won't have very robust pools of human resources available in the
That's,
future.
I think, very interesting, important. There is the self-directed care program.
Right, exactly.
Not widely used.
That's exactly right.
But that's something that could be better
Right.
used. And
So a stipend, sure, that could help, but it's really not
tax
enough.
credit,
Tax credits. But, again, I think we'd have to really do the economic analysis.
yeah,
So,
right,
yeah.
right. So here's a question that is for Professor Liu. Is Professor Liu saying that the culture of caretakers depends on the level of stress?
Yeah.
If the culture is used to take care of their parents, there's less stress than if they're not.
Well, yeah, that's the other part of my research.
Okay.
So from the same study we mentioned, I also examined just a direct association between filial expectation and stress. So what I found is people who have higher expectation for themselves, actually they reported less stress. Also, the person who evaluate their actual performance also at a higher level, they also experience less stress. But the stress, only the person whose gap between these two things is large, then the stress is high.
And the link to culture, from what you're saying, is not absolute.
Yeah.
There are cultures who are more likely to have high expectations and to perform at high levels and to feel the satisfaction of that. But in every culture, there are people who have high expectations and people have low expectations of themselves, and people who really step in to take care of the family and people who don't. I know my experience in this country is it seems like there's one person in every family who is the designated
I hope
taking
it's
care
not a
of my-
female.
Well, not in
But
my
you're
family.
right,
okay.
Not in my family it was me,
Okay.
but there were no
Yeah.
females to choose from.
All right,
so.
okay. But
Yes.
there are within group variations too, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's why I think at the end of the paper, at the end of the study, I really recommend professionals like social workers who work with the family caregivers to really go to a little bit deeper,
Right.
Into the conversation about what the caregivers expect themselves and what kind of the evaluation they give to themselves. That really could help us to understand where their stress come from and how to handle that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. The
Yeah.
exploration of people's values in some way. Yeah, interesting, interesting. Could someone speak to what kind of long-term care model they might wish to see?
I almost don't want to take that on because I'll go on forever.
No, you can do it. You can do it in a couple of sentences.
In a couple of sentences?
Couple of sentences.
Ask my class.
Well, I've been known to speak for 2 hours too. But
Yeah.
you,
Well, I think I'd want one that really assures access to all people, irrespective of the language they speak, the race, etc., making sure that there's gender equity involved, and making sure that, frankly, we have coverage for services in a way that not just the wealthy can, make use of certain services. What's fascinating about long-term care is it used to be we had only a white population in nursing homes. Now we
Yes.
see more people of color in nursing homes, with the white populations in assisted living and other options. So I want to be sure that, there's...
now, the people of color who are in nursing homes, this really
Right.
interests me. Are they recent immigrants or are
No.
they people... So they've become acculturated to...
No, I think it has a lot to do with whether you have the resources to be able to go into alternative models.
But it used
So-
to be, at least it was my impression, that
Right.
the non-white cultures were so insistent on taking care of their own that it wasn't just a lack of resources that they didn't put them in
Right,
nursing homes. They
right.
just insisted on it.
And
So
they
I'm-
try.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I was just curious whether, because we find in the field of mental health
right.
that immigrants have better mental health than non-immigrants. Over,
It
by and large.
I would say that would be a selection bias.
Yeah, I
Large
agree.
selection
We're both
bias.
going to disagree with you
Yeah,
on that.
well, that's
yeah.
what the epidemiological studies
Yeah.
show, and I think it makes
It
sense. And then
depends on-
over time, as they become more Americanized, they have
Yeah.
higher levels of mental illness.
I think it largely depends on where the data come from
Yeah.
and how they do the sampling.
Could be.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
Yeah, even
Yeah.
the assessment tools,
Yeah.
Right.
whether the skill really validate,
Right, right.
in minority populations.
Right, I
Yeah.
agree with you. Yeah.
Well, I won't diverge into that
No, that's okay,
that
so-
area of debate. But I was just, it seems to me that as people become acculturated in America, that they take on more American values.
Or they resist them.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
So, okay, since we have so many questions, we will go past 12:30 if needed to make up for the delayed start.
This is long-term Facebook, right?
Right. Okay, in terms of national economies, what will be the implication of older people having the desire and ability to remain in the workforce, while younger people are also entering the job market? So are we going to keep young people from getting jobs? I guess that's the question.
We have to really sit down and talk about that one, because I think there are lots of older people who want to stay in the workforce, and at the same time, we don't want to crowd out the younger people. So there are questions of equity, there are questions of, frankly, arrangement of work hours, etc. And so that dialogue, I think, needs to, well, maybe it's a trilogue, needs to occur between employers as well as older populations and younger populations. I know for myself that I love to work. That's my
Right.
disease, you
Right.
know? But I would not
Or your
want,
cure.
or my cure, but I don't want to crowd out my daughter's generation. So I think that's a big question that deserves a real conversation at the national level.
So I'm fairly optimistic about it, that older people can continue to work or take on new roles.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of older people who, for example, become home health aides.
Right.
When
Right.
they age, they finished whatever their work was in their lives. They've retired from
Right.
that. And while it may be that helps to keep the wages low, which is not a great thing for home health work, I'm not advocating for that, they do need less money. They don't need to have health care coverage, so it keeps costs down. But we have such a shortage of good home health care aides. So
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah, I think
struggle
it's
there, too.
important to understand why some older adults want to keep working. You know, some may actually don't need the money. They
Right.
just want to have a role.
Right.
Some ones maybe just want to keep the regular schedule, like a work schedule in their
Mhm.
lives. So they don't want to retire. So depends on what's the reason. Then maybe we could have different solutions.
Yep,
for
that's
Well, the
different
roles
groups.
of volunteers are very important.
Yes.
Yeah.
that's-
So
That's right.
there are many of us who are my age and younger and older who are doing volunteer work instead of working for pay.
Yeah.
And they're able to do that.
Can I share an anecdote with you?
Certainly.
So many years ago, we conducted a study, and actually we did it with a group that came in, focus groups, several of them, all men, and we sat behind a two-way mirror. And we asked them, what's it like to be retired? And for the first 5 minutes, it's just wonderful. I love it. I go golfing. And then after that, it spiraled down. And the spiraling down had to do with, I don't know. I don't need to get up in the morning. I don't need to get dressed.
Right.
I don't know who I am. I don't have a card anymore. I don't know how to introduce myself. And actually, golfing every day is really not that much fun. So I think we've got a lot to do to figure out how to legitimize the activities of older adults without making them feel somehow pushed to the margins, So,
Well, I think you're right about that. I also think there's a huge psychological component to this.
absolutely.
So, I know many people who are retired now, and people like you and me.
I'm
need-
younger than him.
That's right. A whole lot younger than me. A whole lot younger. But people with psychology like
Yeah.
ours want to keep making a contribution and keep
Right.
going and doing that. So do it as a volunteer, you do it for pay, but
Yeah.
we want to keep going. There are other people who really just say, I paid my dues.
Yeah.
I did my 40 years.
Yeah.
And I can just rest on that now. I've earned it, and,
Right.
and,
And
they're
that's
fine.
fine.
And they're fine with
And
it.
that's
yeah.
good, yeah.
Yeah, it's really quite different. More
Yeah.
questions. Can anyone speak about the loneliness that seniors experience at this stage in their lives? Well, I'll just respond
Yeah.
quickly. What stage is that? Being old is not one stage. But go ahead. Who wants to respond to the loneliness
Yeah.
question?
What I can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, loneliness is a big issue.
Yeah.
Yes. So when we talk about mental health in later life, so usually we mention about depression, but actually the diagnosis of depression, the rate in older people is lower than the prevalence in younger groups.
That's right.
But loneliness is very robust. It's very significant among older adults. So that's why I mentioned about the transition, from working to retirement,
Yeah.
and also social network. That's also very important. So in my recent study, I haven't published it yet, but I look at how important the friendship is for older people. So I look at the loss of friends. It is very significant in
Yeah.
shaping loneliness of
Yeah.
older people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Stop and think about 72,000 centenarians in the U.S., 49,000 in China, and I can't remember, I 52,000 in Japan.
Mhm.
Centenarians, right?
Nobody's left.
My father said at my funeral, please do not have a big formal thing because all of my friends have died.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So,
No, my
very-
mother-
yeah,
My
exactly.
mother was the same thing.
Yeah.
At her 90th birthday, it was amazing. We had 90 guests.
Right.
That's how big her network was at 90. She died at 101,
Yep.
101st birthday,
Mhm.
and we had 15 or 20 people who came to
Exactly.
a small
Yeah,
memorial service.
Exactly. So what Jinyu
So-
has been saying, I think, is really, really true. We have to disentangle depression and other, manifestations, right, from loneliness.
Well, I think that's extremely important. I think
Yeah.
there is a tendency to overdiagnose.
Right.
And,
Generalize.
yes, people are lonely and
Right.
people are sad.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they're depressed, and it
Right.
doesn't mean that the appropriate response to them is treatment for a mental illness, let alone giving
Not
them
a
an
pill.
antidepressant
Yeah,
Yeah,
medication.
not a pill.
Right.
I wrote an article some years ago for residences that serve people, which I said, the people you're now calling depressed and diagnosing and giving pills to, they're lonely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They need to have relationships
Right,
with people.
Yeah,
That's
they
what
need
they
social
need.
engagement.
Exactly.
They
Right.
need to talk to people.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is why long-term care is the domain of social work, because we really focus on social support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, going back to that, one of the things that concerns me lately is that for many very good reasons, there has developed a lot of negative thinking about nursing homes. And I think there's very good reason for that.
Uh-huh.
On the other hand, some people who age in place in utter isolation
Right.
or with only home health care workers as their companions, and they're just bereft. They've lost opportunity for any kind of activity that involves other people and that might engage them with some interests.
Do you want to say, I can say something from a policy perspective, but please go ahead.
Yeah. So that really related to my recent project I just started.
Yeah.
So recently I started looking at all homebound older adults who usually have high risk of isolation, social isolation. And I think one solution probably that I'm trying to figure out, technology may play a role, in helping the homebound older adults who are more usually isolated to connect them to the society, to the community, to the neighborhood, to their friends, by providing some opportunities for their social engagement.
Right.
And you were going to comment from a policy point of view.
Well, in 1999, I think it was, the Olmsted
Yes,
decision
right.
was actually rendered, and it gave people really more opportunity to decide whether they wanted to be in their homes or a less restrictive environment or potentially in a nursing home. And I think that if you looked at where people landed, most people chose not to be in a nursing home. That's
Absolutely.
the preference, right? That's not to say that nursing homes are not a good environment for everyone. So when you made your statements earlier, what you were indicating is that we have some quality assurance issues in every kind of
Absolutely.
service that we provide.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. A related question. The Medicaid managed long-term care program, says that it's crucial to allow older adults to age in place. But this person says, I have found them to be terrible at providing adequate hours, services needed for individuals to remain in their home, and so forth, a number of other criticisms. So I don't know if either of you knows about the managed long-term care program in New York.
Well,
I think that's what our
yeah,
listener is talking about.
they're not perfect, And again, it goes back to, frankly, financing.
Right.
So I get it, and with limited dollars, that's what we end up with.
Well, and there are many problems with the managed long-term care
Right.
program here. One of them, the size of the caseloads is
Exactly.
ridiculous. So
Right.
if you're talking about providing any meaningful case management or
Right.
social work-like support, then it's
Exactly.
not there. The other thing is they don't have a mental health benefit.
Yep.
These plans do not have a mental health benefit.
Right.
So if you sign up for the managed long-term care program in New York State, you're just saying, okay, I'm never going to get a mental health service.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
very strange.
Yep. It's true.
Last two questions. What is your opinion of Medicaid Spenddowns and using an elder law attorney to hide finances as a way to get Medicare Medicaid combo for long-term care? Anybody?
Well, it's a really two-part question. It's not one question.
Big
So we have
question.
3 last questions there.
All right.
But, let me say, I don't like the spend down, but I'm not about to break the law.
So you would have people be eligible for public coverage of
Well,
care, not
yeah.
just in nursing homes, but long-term care.
Yes, public coverage,
Right.
if necessary, yeah.
Because that's essentially what this does.
Yeah,
is
so actually, the truth is that many, many people know how to evade.
Well, there's a whole
the spend
industry
down.
of lawyers
Exactly.
out there who
Right.
help families to set up
Right.
trusts, and they transfer
Yeah.
the funds. And
Right.
now there's a 3 or 5 year look back.
So what I was about to say is it depends on when you consult those
Yeah.
professionals as well, because the look-back period is
Yeah.
significant.
Well, there's a really fundamental question, it seems to me, about that Medicaid is health insurance for poor people.
Right,
And so if Medicaid is going to pay for something, you're supposed to be poor.
right.
And now people who have not been poor are finding ways to transfer their assets so that they look like
Which
they're
is
poor.
why I think we need a universal program. I really do.
So the solution here is not continued Medicaid fraud, but
to think,
to have a kind of universal coverage that
Yeah.
Out of the
includes
box.
long-term
Yes,
care.
yes,
right?
why not?
Yes.
Right?
Of course, we still don't have, health care.
We don't have universal health care
Right.
yet.
But if we're going to do it, as they tried with the ACA, let's build it in.
There was another part to that question, but we've lost it. The final question is for you, Jinyu.
Okay,
All right, you can see it there. What are the ways to support caregivers psychologically,
based on my study.
based on your study?
Yes, I really love the questions today. That's all kind of really helped me to let you know what I'm doing.
That's so good.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, a study. I hope with the fund. Probably I will get the funding from NIH because I got a very good review score.
And we're already celebrating.
All right.
But
But
anyway,
answer
yeah,
the
okay,
question.
go ahead.
Yeah,
Answer the
because
question.
that proposal is really addressing this question. So in the past year, I look at the psychological needs and stress of dementia caregivers in Chinese communities. Because dementia caregivers, because of the nature of the caring task, they usually are the caregivers who experience much higher stress and sometimes even depression. It's a pretty tough job. So from my qualitative interview and survey questionnaires, the results, it shows there is a huge need of psychological support among the Chinese dementia caregivers. So what I plan to do is to develop volunteering programs to support Chinese caregivers. What I'm going to do is to train and monitor the experiential caregivers in Chinese communities who used to take care of their,
I see. Yeah.
and then to let them give them opportunity, give them training, and also appropriate monitoring, and let them to help their peers, maybe who are new, relatively new to the caregiving task.
I'll be interested to see what happens with that.
Yeah,
I've
me
been
too.
very interested in Mary Middleman's work on,
Sure,
this, and
sure.
one of the things that she points out is that the mental health system, which should be providing support, is not set up to do it.
Right.
And this is true in many, many areas. Our mental health system is a system of, I'm going to sit in my office and wait for you to come to me. I'm going to give you psychotherapy and or a
Right.
pill.
Right.
And if you're not coming to my office Tuesday at 3 o'clock, I can't help you.
Right.
And as Mary Middleman points out, family caregivers are under too much time pressure to do that. If you're
And
going to help them,
stress.
you've got to go to them.
Yep.
Yeah.
You've got to meet in places that are convenient for them, and at times that may be 10 o'clock at night at the
Right,
local diner, but
right.
it can't
Yeah.
work the way our mental health system is set up
Right.
to do
Yeah.
it. I think we've run out of time, and I hope you've enjoyed our conversation. I certainly
We've
have.
had a
I
lot
think,
of
Yes,
fun.
we-
Yeah,
we
thank
covered
you.
Thank
a
you.
broad area today. I thank
Yeah.
both of you for
Well, we're
being
especially pleased that Jinyu could be here and share her research because
It's
she's doing
very
wonderful
interesting work.
work.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you.
interesting.
Thank you, Jeanette.
Wonderful work.
here. I'd like to talk about it more, maybe another time.
Maybe
We can-
another
Maybe.
time.
We can
Yeah.
do that. We hope that you will see us next week. It says here I'm supposed to say we hope to see you next week, but we can't see you. So we hope
true.
you will see us next week, that you'll be back. We'll be here, we hope, next week at noon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.